And then I think I'd like to allow Tushar to introduce himself. So Tushar, please go ahead.
Hello everyone, I'm Tushar from India. I'm one of the FLTs for Hindi language at Wesleyan this year. And I'm going to talk about one of the recent protests in India, which is about CAA, Citizen Amendment Bill. So Act particularly, this is Act right now. So I'm going to just focus on certain issues, important issues about the protest. Thank you.
Thank you, Tushar, and thank you, everyone. I think this is all of us, so I think we can probably maybe start with our presentation. Clara, I'd like you to introduce yourself, and after that, if you will, you can start by discussing the topic you've chosen for us.
Sure. So I am Clara Zigelmier. I reside in Paris, France. Uh, I am rather involved in protests in France. I try to attend any protest I can within uh, where my safety is guaranteed. I would enjoy to talk about today about how this year has seen repression by the police and the government increase a lot in France, helped by the COVID situation, and very lately the two terrorist attacks that happened. Um, so that's it. I don't know if I should start what I wanted to talk about.
I
Uh,
think that I see that Kalilu has joined us,
oh,
so maybe we could take the chance to introduce the last of the FLTAs that's going to be joining us today. So Kalilu, if you can hear us, and if you can turn on your webcam, and if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself. Otherwise, maybe yes, Clara, you can go ahead and tell us something more about it.
so maybe a first presentation of the year in France is it's been a very troublesome year with a lot of social protests and social issues with the COVID. We've had basically we've had in December a very strong social movements because there was a social reform which created a lot of strikes, a lot of protestation and protests and demonstrations, which led to a first economic crisis in France. Then we had to go under lockdown in March, which further deepened the economic crisis. And then we're amid the second lockdown. There were issues with the retirement reform that is going to cut a lot of money into my my retirement and a lot of French people. Um, there also has been feminist protests. There also have been a lot of protests from the public function, so hospitals, education, etc. All of that that has been really historical. Um, and there's also has been what is called the Justice for Adama protest, which is um, kind of in link with what happened with George Floyd, but also uh, very French, as uh, Adama was a young man that died in kind of the same circumstances as George Floyd back in 2016. And since then, his sister has been fighting to recognize the police violence and abuse that was done and that led to his death. And so, in this context, there has been a polarization with, on the one side, demonstrators, protesters defending social movements, and on the other side, the government and the police that has increasingly become more oppressive and more violent, which is why I said I try to attend protests when my security is warranted. That is to say, nowadays in France, you should not go to a protest if you're not at least with someone going to a protest alone is very dangerous because the approach the police has on with protests is really a repression and approach. That is to say, the goal is to disband the demonstration. It's not to safeguard it and make sure it's okay. It's to disband it. There are very tactical tactics that you can recognize very easily when you're at a protest. That is to provoke, to repress, to beat people, etc. And it's become more and more alarming because um, the more and more laws and more strategies have been passed by the government, especially taking advantage of COVID. That is to say that demonstrations were one of the first things forbidden. They have been forbidden even when the situation got better, but um, some demonstrations were still taking place and more or less repressed depending on the topic. That is to say, for instance, we had uh, very recently we had gathering protests in front of churches in order to reload the masses to take place, and no cops was seen to be causing demonstration. That didn't happen. Whereas as soon as it's a social movement, more progressive, it's extremely repressed. And I think that's the last one. That's coming down to the last one I want to talk about is currently it's a very, very heated situation because since there were two terrorist attacks in France, and that led to a law proposition that is called the Loi de Sécurité Globale, Global Security Law, and it basically it wants to um, allows cops to monitor demonstration via drones, uh, so it will allow mass identification, to have folders on who is going to which demonstration, and also on monitoring where demonstrations are going, and so to better control them and repress them more violently. And also one of the big issue in that law is that it wants to forbid sharing pictures of cops with their faces on social media. And it's not even certain where it is, because basically in the law it said uh, any picture that would deteriorate a cop's mental, physical situation. But then the minister said on TV that it would just be forbidding any picture of a cop on social media. That would also mean that that a cop could arrest journalists and say, no, you don't have, and then the journalists would be released because they have the right to do so, but their job would be stopped there because they couldn't report anymore. So it's very, it's, yeah, so it's a demonstration in France is considered as a fundamental right, but the polarization has been, that has been increasing between security with COVID and terrorism versus social movement is becoming more and more important. And it's definitely something to watch for.
Well, thank you, Clara, for the overview that you've given us. If anyone has any questions, if anyone would like to ask Clara something, please feel free to do so. And also, I'd like to give you all the opportunity whenever you basically speak up, if you want to introduce yourself. We didn't go through everyone because otherwise we would be here all day. But I want to make sure that you know that you have the opportunity to do so if you feel like doing that. Okay, so thank you, Clara. I know that Tushar has got something for us. Tushar, you should also have access to the Padlet. So if you wanna show us some media.
Mhm.
Please.
Right. Thank you so much. I hope I can share the screen. Okay. Right. So, Tommaso, can you just clarify whether the screen is visible or not?
Yes, you are a
Yeah.
co-host, so we can all see, and I think everyone is able to see your screen. So you're good
Right.
to go.
Thank you. So this is basically about the recent protest that actually shook the entire nation, India, to be specific, which is called Citizenship Amendment Act, which was a bill when the protest began, but which later which turned into an act. So I'll be just talking about certain key aspects in this moment. I'll use some slides to make it more clear or understanding for a better understanding for the concept. Okay, so first thing, it is a protest I named as defining unity, because it has a lot to do with the kind of let's say discrimination based on the religion, or let's say the race. So basically, a citizenship amendment, it came into act on December 11, 2019. So this particular bill was passed in the Parliament of India, and uh, the idea behind this particular bill or act was, to provide a path, or to create a path for all the migrants who are coming from neighboring countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, to give those migrants, citizenship, or offer them citizenship. To be specific, it is limited to certain faiths, and those are, let's say, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jain, Parsi, and Christians. Surprisingly, there is a turning point here, which I'll talk about more in the coming part. One of the religious faith, or let's say the category, was avoided deliberately, I would say. That was Muslims. So they do not belong to this particular act. They cannot be, they cannot take, or they cannot just opt for this option and become a citizen of India. So uh, according to the recent update, the cutoff date for being eligible for citizenship is December 2040. So you need to at least spend around, let's say, minimum 5 years in India as a migrant. So that means you should enter India around 2009 or 10. Let's turn 2009, I would say, and then you are eligible for that. So this is specifically for the people who have already migrated. Previously, the date was different. It was only limited to the people who came before 1971, according to Assam Accord. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So yes, the idea behind introducing this bill was, supposedly these particular faiths or people from, let's say, Hindu, Sikhs, and Buddhists, so they are suffering from religious persecution in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan because of their minority status. So that is the bit. And the government believes that Muslims, they cannot be put under the minority status because Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, they are basically Muslim countries. So that is one reason that was given as a justification for the act, or let's say exclusion of the community. Now, what is the problem behind the then protest? Why people came onto the streets? So this is not a very new battle actually. This has been there for around 30 or 40 years. So the origin of this came from the northeast part of India, that is called Assam or Tripura to be specific. Uh, a lot of infiltration or a lot of migration happened from Bangladesh around 1971. From Bangladesh to, let us say, these northern states in India, Assam and Tripura to be specific. So what happened that there was an accord signed by the Prime Minister, which was about saving the ethnic identity of these northeast regions. And according to the act, there was a settlement that people from these particular neighboring countries will not be allowed to, or will not be eligible to be a citizenship after 1971. So that is something, changed, that has been changed in the recent act or recent bill, so to say. The major reason for that was, there was actually NRC going on in the state of Assam, and that took around, let's say, 10 years span with a lot of expenditure, manual as well as, manual efforts as well as, economic burden on the Indian, what can you say, economy. So the result was not as the government expected, because around 1.9 million people, they were, they were kind of, they were found without the documents. So the entire category was into that particular zone, and surprisingly, majority of the people were Hindus. And obviously, no political party would love to give away their, vote bank. So then came the idea of CAB or CAA. So this is like a passing door where you can just offer. The bill says that if the scrutiny happens, and if you belong, if you don't have the documents, the communities I'm talking about, except Muslims, any other community, if you don't have a document, you can be given the citizenship. But if you are, if you follow the faith of Muslims or Islam, then you have to go through go through different scrutiny. So you may not be allowed, and you'll be sent back to your respective countries. So that is the one thing that promoted the introduction of, CAB or CAA. Now, you can see that the major reason behind the nationwide protest was, exclusion of these particular Muslim communities. And Northeast, they had a different idea. They wanted to save their ethnic identity. They didn't want any political intrusion or cultural identity to be preserved, and their rights about land and, let's say, votes should be reserved. So they were worried about their ethnic identity, but and the other part was exclusion of Muslim community from this one. So yes, so that is one thing. Then you can see the particular part I want to focus here is about the students from different parts or regions of India. So many universities, central universities, state universities, even private institutions, they participated large number in this protest. And you can see the map here, almost from every part of India, nation, people or students participated in this. So there was resistance from various universities and institutes, that is youth of India. That was something, striking or going against the policy of the present government. Then second highlight of the event was, the women, particularly in Delhi, national capital, women laid the way for the protest. The particular place called Shahin Bagh. These women sat there for around 90 days, and it was led by only these women communities. And I would say 90% of the women, they were first time participants in the protest. And that was a very positive, I would say, or we can say, a feminist way to look at it. So first time coming out and sitting there on the streets in the winter for around 90 days was something government did not expect. But unfortunately, due to COVID-19 lockdown, the protest had to be stopped. So yes, and there were a lot of, you can say, uh, what you can say, encroachment by the police, by the government, where students were beaten. There was encroachment in the university campuses where libraries were broken, students were beaten up, and a lot of things. So that is something that put oil into the fire. And these two particular famous poems, I would say, or let's say ghazal, came into picture a lot. I have this a short clip, I'll just show you in a minute, where these songs became these songs of resistance. Hum kagaz nahi dikhayenge. We won't show you the papers. So people are supposed to show the papers to prove their citizenship. That is what the idea is. We won't show the papers. And second was hum dekhenge. We shall see, like how far you go and how far we fight. It's a famous ghazal. I'll just show you a small clip here, and then I would end this particular presentation. So you'll get some idea about the ghazal, which is a very famous, particularly written for the resistance in Pakistan, and which has been used here.
हम देखेंगे लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे वो दिन के जिसका वादा है हम देखेंगे जो लोहे अज़ल में लिखा है हम देखेंगे जब जुल्म सितम के कोहे गरा रोई की तरह उड़ जाएंगे हम देखेंगे हम महकूमों के पाँव तले ये धरती धड़केगी और अहले हकम के सरों पर जब बिजली कड़केगी हम देखेंगे बस नाम रहेगा अल्लाह का जो गायब भी है हाजिर भी जो मंजर भी है नाजिर भी उठेगा अनल हक का नारा जो मैं भी हूँ और तुम भी हो और राज करेगी खल्क़े खुदा जो मैं भी हूँ और तुम भी हो हम देखेंगे लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे हम देखेंगे
Right, I'll just wind it up in 30 seconds. This particular idea about exclusion of particular community actually goes against the Indian constitution, because India is known as a secular country, and excluding one particular community from this particular bill or act shows the discriminatory nature of the government's policy. That is one thing very prominent in this particular protest. And as usual, like even Clara said about the police brutality, because police is controlled by the central government, and not a single moment came into the picture in 3 months where political leaders came and visited these protesters. So that was something, it was unexpected, but certainly COVID-19 affected the entire process, entire resistance, and hopefully it continues after the lockdown as well, because they are planning to implement the NRC, National Register of Citizens, in the entire nation, which is something shocking. So people are obviously against the idea of NRC and CAA. So that's all about this protest. If you have any doubt or questions, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Tushar. Thank you for discussing with us this interesting topic. It's a situation that I was not really too familiar with, so I really appreciate your perspective on it, on the subject.
Mhm.
And this actually gives me the opportunity to segue into the presentation by Marta, because we will be discussing the idea about nationality, ethnicity, and the protests related to these kind of things with Marta and Catalonia. So Marta, please go ahead. Sorry, yes, Stephen, you have a question. Yes.
Could I ask a quick question? Thank you. So I'm Steve Angle. I'm teach Chinese philosophy, and I'm the director of the Free Center. This has been fascinating so far. I'm looking forward to the second half. Tushar, a question for you. So you talked about the CAB becoming the CAA. I gather that means it's now law. Is there any further possibility of change, of constitutional review, or is this sort of a done deal?
At this moment, it is a kind of done deal, but people have approached the Supreme Court, and there is a kind of hope that Supreme Court will form a committee and this will be reviewed again. So there is a hope, I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for your question. I'd like to thank you all for being here with us. This is a first for us, because this is the first time that we do this kind of thing remotely via Zoom. So it's great being able to see you all and to share this moment with all of you. So Marta, if you will.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Tommaso, for introducing me that well. So I'm going to talk about the protest celebrated last year in Barcelona due to the Catalonia Independence issue. So the background of this is that the Spanish autonomous community of Catalonia has a long-established independence movement which seeks to establish Catalonia as an independent, a sovereign republic. So this means breaking off the Kingdom of Spain. So this issue started in 2014 when a non-binding Catalan self-determination referendum resulted in a victory for proponents of Catalan independence. So the Catalan authorities after that decided to conduct another referendum in 2017. So afterwards, they proclaimed independence of Catalonia. However, the Spanish government considered this an act of illegal separatism and appealed to the Spanish Supreme Court to block the referendum. So finally, the Supreme Court ordered Catalonia to cancel the referendum. So it's in this moment when the protest with when all the protests start in 2019. So these protests mainly were against the sentencing of the Catalan independence leaders. So they began on October 14 at the Barcelona El Prat airport, just hours after the Spanish Supreme Court announced its verdict. And by the afternoon, thousands of protesters had already gathered at the airport, actually forcing the airport to close. So afterwards, then the Catalan government, led by the pro-independence Quim Torra, called for both the amnesty of the convicted leaders and a renewed attempt to realize Catalan independence. However, on October 19, following a fifth consecutive night of violence and due to this huge violence, the Catalan president Quim Torra called for talks between the Catalan independence movement and the Spanish government, adding that violence had never been like the flag of the independence movement, but the head of the Spanish government refused to hold talks with the Catalan government, and as it deemed the former had not condemned the violence strongly enough. So this Spanish government rejected the idea of discussing Catalan independence, stating that it was impossible under Spanish law. So despite the pleas of the Catalan leaders for the demonstrations to remain peaceful, violence once again erupted by nightfall, leading to clashes between protesters and police forces for the sixth night in a row. So then the protests ended, but nowadays this issue is not already sorted. The central government ended up disabling Quim Torra, that was like the president of Catalonia. And now there is no president in Catalonia, there is an acting president. And the other Catalan politics are like in standby. So the dialogue between the central government and Catalonia is paralyzed due to the COVID thing, and is not in the main agenda as well, because the media is not talking about this anymore, because COVID-19 is like the thing more important now. So kind of, in my opinion, this is something that could have been worked out before all these riots in the streets, if the central government have wanted to hear the people, because they have been ignoring their petitions since forever. And actually, because most of the people don't want the independence of Catalonia, they only want to be here by the government. And I think that this stuff about ignoring is the cause of the violence. So finally, I also want to share a video with all of you. So maybe I can share my screen. Okay. Yes, and this is it.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for sharing this with us. And now we'll remain in Spain because Marco is going to talk next. So, Marco, feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tommaso. Well, I'm going to move to another different topic. I'm going to talk about the different protests that took place in Spain since the COVID-19 crisis appeared in our lives. Well, as you know, COVID-19 has changed like the way we relate each other, the way we live, we work, we study, and it has been clash between forces in the government in order to fight the high incidence of the virus in Spain. So first of all, I think it's necessary to locate all of you in a brief summary of the Spain politics. I'm going to focus on Madrid because it's my city and it's how it's the protests I live. But there is a lot of protests I'm going to talk about that could be extrapolated to other parts of Spain. Well, the central government of Spain is a left-wing party's coalition between PSOE and Podemos, and the regional government of Madrid is a right-wing party's coalition between Partido Popular, Vox, and Ciudadanos. So there is kind of clash, ideologic clash between both governments. So I'm going to talk about three different kind of protests that were carried out in Madrid and in other parts of Spain. The first one is a protest that took place in May 2020 in Madrid, but this was like the origin of other protests that were spread in other parts of Spain. These protests were known as the Núñez de Balboa. Núñez de Balboa is a street in Madrid, in the Barrio de Salamanca, which is one of the privileged areas in Madrid. So in May 2020, the government, the central government, began what was known as La Desescalada, which consisted in different phases in order to start a new phase in the pandemic. The people started to go out to the streets, and the problem here was that Madrid, because it is the capital of Spain and because it has a high levels of population, was not authorized by the central government to implement new measures as in other territories in Spain. So there were people in some zones in Madrid which protested against the central government because of this injustice, and where these people, there were not violence in these protests. Well, there were some isolated cases of people who burned garbage containers and other stuff in the street, but they were isolated cases, and the people in this protest simply go to the street with bands and other objects to make noise, and these were the first important protests in Spain, which were seen as nationalist or patriotic protest, because the people who protest were voters or supporters of conservative parties, and in the protest there were a high amount of Spanish flags and constitutional flags, and they were seen as such. Then the second protests took place in September 2020 in the southern areas of Madrid. The southern neighborhoods of Madrid are known because they are inhabited by people with low income levels and precarious jobs. So these people were carried out by these protests were carried out by people who were against the regional government, which, friendly reminder, was conservative. These protests, as I've said, were carried out in September, and it was because as a consequence of the high incidence of the virus after summer, especially in those areas, the regional government decided to implement a new measure which consisted in selected lockdowns in several zones of Madrid where the high incidence of the virus were more than determined levels. So there were so many people that took the streets and protests against this measure because they claimed that these new measures were not following sanitary criterion, and that it was a consequence of the ideological position of the government, and they accused them of segregationists, classists, and racists. And highlight in these second protests were the police violence and the police repression. There were the police charged again the protesters of the southern neighborhoods of Madrid, and it was very criticized by the public opinion because like it demonstrated the difference in the police performance between privileged neighborhoods as in Núñez de Balboa in May, and the southern neighborhoods of Madrid in September 2020, which is known as low-income areas. So it was very criticized by the general public opinion. But this was a case in Madrid, not in the rest of Spain, because it was a measure implemented by the regional government. And lastly, the third protests took place a month ago in October 2020. And these are special ones because they were carried out by random people who didn't follow solely one ideological or political position, but according to the Spanish media, the people who participated in these protests were people sympathizing with anti-system groups, neo-Nazis, and anarchists, among all. So there were random people of all ideologies who carried out protests, violent protests in Madrid and other parts of Spain as a consequence of the curfew implemented by the government, given the high incidence of the virus in Spain. So in the 2 weeks ago, during the whole weekend, a lot of people took to the streets and they burned garbage containers, they attacked the shops, they robbed some objects in the shops, they destroyed the urban furniture, and even they attacked people. So it was a protest who was characterized not only by the violence of the protesters, but also by the violence of the police. A lot of people was arrested, and there was a lot of violence, and the general public opinion was like against these protests because in my opinion there wasn't form to protest against anything. And if I have some time, I would like to share one video of the Núñez de Balboa protests and the latest protests, violent protests. And I may share my screen. Yes. These were the first protests in Madrid, and as you've seen, these protests were at Barrio de Salamanca, and there was a lot of Spanish flags, and they are claiming freedom and the demission of the central government and the president. And then I am going to share you a video. I'm going to cut the video because it is a long video, for you to make an idea of how the violent protests were contrasted to the first one protests. Well, I think you can make an idea of how the violent protest of October in Spain occurred. So thank you very much of listening to me, and I hope you have enjoyed my intervention, and I'm happy to ask whatever question you have.
Well, thank you, Marcos, for talking about the current situation in Spain. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Tushar. And thank you, Clara. If any of you has any question, if you have anything that you would like to ask our panel, in the meantime, I'd like to tell you something about the situation here in Italy. I am Tommaso, your host. I didn't introduce myself before, but I'm doing that now. And since I'm from Italy, I would like to share the situation that we're living through right here, right now. So, as you may or may not know, we are currently nearing our second lockdown. Sorry, the government is changing their minds every day, basically. But we've already been through our first lockdown earlier this year, and now the only solution appears to be that a second lockdown might be imminent. So, as you can imagine, this kind of measures require a lot of how can I put it? A lot of dedication, because otherwise people feel abandoned. It's entirely understandable that maybe it is not entirely understandable if you take a look at the situation in some of the US, for example. But given the current pandemic and given that it is a global one, maybe the idea, the safest idea would be to pay people to stay home and allow them to basically get through this difficult moment that affects all of us without having to risk their lives to earn an income. And that's why people are currently protesting here in Italy, because the government does not appear to have given enough consideration to the material conditions of people affected by the pandemic. I'd like to show you a couple of things. I have not prepared a presentation like my colleagues, and I've not prepared definitely nothing as fancy as what Tushar did before. So I'm sure I won't be able to capture your attention just as well. But if you will indulge me, I'd like to share with you a couple of articles. These are from the basically, this is like our Reuters, a news agency. So this is ANSA. This is the national news agency. They publish the news as they happen. So this is in Naples in the south of Italy. There's been several clashes with the police already, and the thing that struck me is this title. This is a couple of days ago. It's November the 14th. The title says, and I translate quite literally, Naples, watch out for outside infiltrators. And I think about this term because I know the term outside agitators. It's something that goes back to the civil rights protests in the 60s, even probably it dates even earlier than that. But what struck me is that this rhetoric being pushed, that there's people turning protests into violent clashes with the police because there's someone from outside that's inciting this violence. I like to go back to what my colleagues said, and just to go back to what Marcos just said, we are all going through COVID-19. We are all dealing with the consequences of this global pandemic. And I think it's entirely understandable that people who feel left behind, who feel that they are not taken care of, might be angry at the current situation. And as we also in the US, this idea, this rhetoric that there's outside agitators infiltrating protests with the aim to turn them into violent ones, has been particularly nefarious during the protests following the murder of George Floyd, for example, just to quote one of the more recent examples that happened during last summer. But as you can all see, I just got an article from the New York Times here just to share with you some things that you might like to look into, if you will, on your own, because this is not something that's exclusive to either the US or Europe or India or whatever. This is the same rhetoric being pushed to basically take advantage of the situation and make the protest and the motives behind the protest less valid. I'm sure you can all remember the fact that, for example, during his time, the protests, the marches that Martin Luther King Jr. took part in, they were deemed violent, they were deemed subversive as well in the newspapers of the time. So this is nothing new, really. And this gives me the opportunity. I know we were going to focus on these more recent events, but I think that history repeats itself. So I think it's interesting to take a look at something that happened 50 years ago in Italy. I'd like to share this picture with you, which is of a protest taking place in 1969 in the city, or rather the town of Battipaglia, which is a very small town. It's approximately there were at the time 30,000 people living there, and most of the people were working in the agricultural fields. Basically, they were just farmers or working in the industries related to farming. And when the two major factories closed down, people were left without a job and without the means to provide for themselves and for their family. They decided to march in protest. And I can translate what this banner says because it's quite telling. So the banner says, enough, or rather stop the massacres, enough with the massacres, disarm the police. This is 50 years ago, because the protest that was sparked by thousands of people losing their job overnight, literally overnight, basically was met with the violence of the state, which is, that is, the police, who opened fire and killed two people, one protester and one bystander that was like looking from a window overlooking the street where the protest was taking place. And so I go back to what I said before, to what we've all experienced. The Black Lives Matter protests during this months that originally emerged during the Obama presidency. So it's not just a phenomenon connected with the Trump presidency. And we'll see what's going to happen now that ideally the US is going to have a new president. But we all know what kind of things have been like for the past decades. And I think, as I said before, history tends to repeat itself. So this is my final message for all of you today. We need to look back to understand what's going on right now and to understand how to go forward. One last thing, I am proud because I was born in Bologna. My hometown is Bologna, which is quite a left-wing city. And last year, the far-right party, Lega, the Lega Nord, which is a racist far-right party that has a substantial majority in our parliamentary system, held a rally in Bologna and filled the place where the rally was being held with two capacity. So there were like 6,000 people gathering in Bologna, as I said before, a left-wing city, for this rally of political party that many have called literally neo-fascists. And the city fought back, and they fought back this way. They gathered in the main square of the city, which is Piazza Maggiore, which literally means main square, and there were 12,000 people, so twice as many. And this is a movement that started in Bologna to say, no, we're not okay with this, we're not okay with a neo-fascist far-right party, and we are here to prove that we're not okay with that. Unfortunately, as you can all imagine, the current situation with COVID-19 has kind of prevented this sort of gatherings, these large gatherings of people. But I'm sure that you can all find examples in your own town, country, city, or whatever. And I think we should all take this as an example. Okay, so that's all from me. Let me stop the sharing of my screen. I'd like to give you all the opportunity to basically ask any questions. If you want to say a few words, feel free to do so. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. It's been an interesting experiment, and I hope we've been successful in providing you with some insight on our local, i.e. national or regional situations. from all across the globe. So once again, I'd like to thank you, my co-hosts. I'd like to thank you, Clara. I'd like to thank you, Marta. I'd like to thank you, Marcos, and Tushar. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all also to all of our guests. So real quick, Emily, Hannah, Kalilu, who's a colleague of ours because he's an FLTAs, Manuel, Lauren, and Elena. Also, thanks to the people who joined and had to leave before. This session will be made available because we've recorded it. So thank you all. If you want to go back, I will be sending, if you want to go back and watch it again, I will be sending you all the link. And for the time being, I'd like to say goodbye to you and till next time. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. This is great.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Bye.
Thank
you
you.
all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Done.
All right. Okay.
Great job.
Okay, we made it. Kalilu, I'm sorry I did not introduce you, but I saw that you had, I don't know, did you let me say that again. I thought you had, okay, yeah. I saw that you were not, Kalilu, are you still here with us? Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Okay. Anyway, I was worried that Kalilu had something to present, but it didn't. So I hope it didn't. Anyways, okay. I'm gonna stop the recording now. So thank you to Shar and welcome. Sorry, and
That was a great job. Thank you so much.
well, I made my best. I'm sorry Lucia couldn't be with us, but yeah.
Yeah, we all feel sorry.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Okay. Tushar,
Bye-bye.
take care.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care.